The Tomb Raider Reboot trilogy is one of the most divisive yet surprisingly successful series of games ever. Each entry seemed to come alongside new controversies and heavy criticisms from longtime fans. Despite this, the trilogy sold over 30 million copies combined. Of the millions of gamers who gave this series a try, it seems many of them came away with wildly different experiences and opinions. So in today's video, I'll be playing through all three games, and we'll be taking a look back at their development, release, and aftermath to figure out what exactly made these games so contentious. Tomb Raider is one of the most iconic video game IPs of all time. Beginning in 1996, Tomb Raider quickly became a massive franchise, getting a new yearly entry for 8 years straight. The franchise was also able to break into mainstream culture in a way that not many games could back then, receiving 2 huge blockbuster movies. But things quickly began to fall apart. The Tomb Raider games were beginning to worsen in quality, with the breaking point coming from The Angel of Darkness. Following that game's awful critical reception, publisher Eidos Interactive moved the IP away from Core Design, the development studio that had made every prior Tomb Raider entry. The franchise was then given to Crystal Dynamics, best known at the time for Gex and Legacy of Kain. From 2006 to 2008, Crystal Dynamics put out a trilogy of Tomb Raider games, beginning with Tomb Raider Legend. This trilogy was more well received than the past few Core Design entries, but things weren't perfect, and the franchise was still struggling to regain the mainstream status and cultural significance it once had. In 2009, Square Enix purchased Eidos, granting them ownership of the Tomb Raider IP. With this came another restructuring for the franchise. Crystal Dynamics would remain the lead developers of the series, but it wouldn't be a continuation of the Legend trilogy. It was time for a reimagining of what Tomb Raider was going to be moving forward. This reboot would feature a darker tone and would aim to make Laura feel more human. After several years of development, a new era began with the game that was appropriately named Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider 2013 is an origin story for Laura. At the beginning of the game, she is a young graduate student embarking on her first expedition with a crew from the ship Endurance. Laura convinces the crew to travel to a place known as the Dragon's Triangle, but on the way there, the ship is hit by a storm, and in the crash, Laura is separated from the others. It's here that the game begins, with Laura having to escape a cave she's been trapped in and attempt to find her friends. The friends that got separated, the deranged lunatics inhabiting the island, and the goal of trying to find your way home gave me total Far Cry vibes. In terms of gameplay, the other obvious comparison is to the Uncharted games. In fact, some would argue it's a bit too similar in this department. I think it's undeniable that Tomb Raider 2013 was hoping to emulate the cinematic action movie style moments that Uncharted became famous for. Combine that with the third-person shooter gameplay, climbing sections, and relics to find, and yeah, the game certainly resembles a lot of the things the Uncharted games had done. This led some fans into a frenzy, even going as far as to call the game a ripoff. I wouldn't go that far, and it was quite ironic to see this narrative around the game form considering the history of those two franchises. There was a time just a few years prior where Uncharted was considered the ripoff game, jokingly being referred to as Dude Raider in its early days. Now the tables had turned, with Tomb Raider being called the ripoff. While there's certainly nothing wrong with Tomb Raider taking inspiration from Uncharted, the degree to which they did so upset many of Tomb Raider's longtime fans. Tomb Raider 2013's attempt to modernize the franchise pushed it down a path that was much more action-oriented than any of the prior entries. While previous games in the franchises consistently had combat and action elements, the main focus was almost always on exploration and puzzles. But Tomb Raider 2013 flips that around, making the combat and action set pieces the core elements. This is the point where your perception and opinion on the game will completely differ depending on your taste in games and your history with the Tomb Raider franchise. Now for me personally, Uncharted is one of my favorite franchises ever, so any game that can bring me a somewhat similar experience is something I can get behind. If a flashy action romp is what you're looking for, this game will check every box and you will have a phenomenal time. But for the more hardcore Tomb Raider fans who grew up playing the older games, Tomb Raider 2013 is almost unrecognizable. The distinct lack of tomb raiding throughout this entry was quite jarring. In fact, you could practically get through this entire game without seeing a tomb at all. Most, if not all of them, are listed as optional tombs, one of the various points of interest to find throughout the map. Making tombs optional in a Tomb Raider game is certainly quite bizarre, but I suppose the thinking was that they didn't want to slow players down who just wanted action. And while I can understand that, there is unfortunately a much bigger problem here. Not only are the tombs optional, they are ridiculously easy and weirdly short. Most of them require one simple solution and then you're out. There are no intricacies, no tricks, no real critical thinking required. The fact that these tombs are optional should have given the devs the green light to make them as hard as they could. You wouldn't be hindering anyone's progress with a frustrating puzzle, and it could have been a fun challenge for the more traditional Tomb Raider players to enjoy. Instead, they were laughably easy time wasters. It almost felt like the developers didn't even want to put them in the game, or like they forgot until the last second. Tombs feeling like an afterthought in a Tomb Raider game was unforgivable for many, but perhaps the developers knew what they were doing in some sense. Because what Tomb Raider 2013 lacks in traditional exploration and puzzles, it makes up for in almost all other elements of the game. The action is truly fantastic, the gunplay feels great, and the cinematic sequences are breathtaking. I was also very impressed by how well the graphics held up over 10 years later. Overall, I really enjoyed my playthrough of the game. It was truly a great time. However, it's definitely not a perfect game by any means. One of the things that separates Tomb Raider from the Uncharted comparison is the game's extreme brutality. The Uncharted games were always pretty lighthearted, but Tomb Raider on the other hand depicts Laura being tortured, assaulted, impaled, and pretty much anything else you can think of at any chance they get. For some players, it was a bit much, with the game receiving a good amount of controversy at the time for a few of the scenes and what they portrayed. I can certainly understand the aversion to some of the things this game shows because yeah, it can get really intense. But I think the bigger problem is that the over-the-top violence can sometimes feel out of place within the story they are trying to tell. As I mentioned previously, this game is Laura's origin story. She goes from an innocent researcher to a person that must fight for survival. There is a really intense scene early on that leads to Laura killing someone for the first time. It is a huge moment, and you can see Laura struggle to process what she just did. But then, no more than 5 minutes later, she's just mowing down enemies like it's nothing and continues to do so for the rest of the game with literally no remorse. Obviously, it's a video game at the end of the day. Most video game characters are complete psychopaths if you think too hard about it. But the difference is, the Tomb Raider writers chose to make the concept of Laura killing a big thing, but then ditched it immediately. In general, I find the writing to be the weakest part of the game. It's pretty cheesy and generic, almost like you could fit this script into any other action game and it would still fit decently well. Laura's friends all feel like caricatures of basic archetypes. There's the nerdy dude, the big strong guy, the father figure, the mean girl, it's all just very predictable. Ultimately, I think Tomb Raider 2013 requires a certain mindset to be truly enjoyed. If you go into this game expecting a sick action game while you'll play fun combat encounters, blow some stuff up, and run through some awesome set pieces, you will no doubt have a great time. Tomb Raider 2013 is about as video gamey as a video game can get, and there is genuine value in that. And that value was displayed by the rousing success the game was able to have, despite the many criticisms and controversies that surrounded it. According to Game Informer, the game had sold 1 million copies in its first 2 days on the market. The game continued its strong start, selling 3.4 million copies in the first 4 weeks. I would call that a big success, but publisher Square Enix felt differently. In March 2013, Square Enix stated the game had failed to meet their sales expectations. Take this with a grain of salt though, because Square Enix tends to say this about every game they release. And I mean quite literally, every game they release. For whatever reason, Square Enix loves setting absurdly high sales expectations and then letting everyone know the game didn't hit it. For the life of me, I can't understand why they do this. It's just terrible for business and causes negative headlines to come out of products that could easily have been seen as successes. Despite Square Enix's insistence that the game wasn't reaching its targets, Crystal Dynamics said the game had made a profit by the end of 2013. And the profits weren't going to stop there, as in 2014 the game received a port to the recently released PS4 and Xbox One consoles, helping stretch sales even further. Eurogamer reported in March 2015 that Tomb Raider had sold 8.5 million units, making it the best-selling game in the history of the storied franchise. That's an incredibly impressive feat, and with a success like that under their belt, a sequel was inevitable. We first heard of this sequel in August 2013, with Square Enix confirming the follow-up was in development for next-generation consoles. In 2014, we saw the game for the first time at Microsoft's E3 press conference, alongside a surprising announcement. It was revealed that the game would be a timed exclusive to Xbox platforms, not releasing on PC or PlayStation at launch. This wasn't unheard of, as Xbox had gotten pretty aggressive early on in the Xbox One era, courting third-party developers with games like Dead Rising 3 and Rise Son of Rome. Rise of the Tomb Raider joined that list, and Xbox seemed pretty thrilled about it. They pushed this game super hard, almost treating Laura as an Xbox mascot at times. Head of Xbox Phil Spencer said he felt Rise of the Tomb Raider's exclusivity could help them compete with Uncharted, giving them a similar game of their own. Despite the logical business reasons behind the move, fans were understandably very upset with this decision. It sucked for fans who had played the first game on PlayStation or PC who would now have to wait. And it didn't help that Xbox was non-committal about when exactly the game's exclusivity period would end. Xbox controversy aside, Rise of the Tomb Raider's release was quickly approaching, with the official launch coming on November 10th, 2015. Following the events of the first game, Laura is searching for answers. Her experience with the supernatural elements of the island in the first game made her realize her father was right about his crazy theories, despite no one believing him at the time. This story heavily focuses on this theme, as Laura's relationship with her late father serves as the main motivation throughout the game. Laura begins the journey in Syria, searching for the tomb of the lost prophet of Constantinople, but once there, she finds that the tomb is empty. Laura has a run-in with Trinity, a military organization, and the main villains of the game. After escaping Syria, Laura goes home to research her findings further and learns of the divine source, the artifact said to grant immortality. But then a member of Trinity breaks in and is able to steal the information. Laura now must travel to Siberia, not only hoping to find the divine source, but also making sure that Trinity can't get to it first. With the story set, we are off to the races, and once again I was left stunned by the visuals. Rise of the Tomb Raider will be coming up on its 10th anniversary this year, but the game would fit right alongside modern day games today. This starting sequence in the mountains does such an incredible job at setting the tone. They let you know right away that this game is going to be a spectacle, and it filled me with so much anticipation. In terms of the game itself, Rise of the Tomb Raider improves on nearly everything from the first game. The combat feels pretty much the same, which is a good thing as it was the highlight of the 2013 entry. However, there are some added mechanics such as the ability to craft ammo types or throwable objects like Molotovs mid-fight. This is nice, adding a new level of creativity in how you want to attack encounters. I will say though, I noticed something about this mechanic that really bothered me. Oftentimes, the devs would place an item right before a fight, basically spelling out at all times what you should use. For example, there would be multiple random mushrooms scattered on the ground right before walking up to 3 enemies standing next to each other. This is the game's way of telling you to craft a poison arrow and hit them all. The first few times I noticed this, I thought, okay, no big deal, they're just trying to teach me. But it continued on the whole way through. There was never a moment where the game wasn't telegraphing exactly what I should be doing. It also meant that I was rarely low on supplies, which could have added some depth to the game, forcing me to rethink my tactics based on what I had on me. I think that would have made the player feel like a true survivor, backing up the entire message of the trilogy. This complaint aside though, the idea of crafting did add a lot more variety compared to the first game, which was essentially just the same fights over and over again, so I appreciated that. Another big change for Rise of the Tomb Raider was the much needed larger focus on world exploration. First of all, the game actually has tombs. Yes, that's right folks, it may have taken 2 games to get here, but the Tomb Raider Reboot trilogy has finally incorporated tombs into the main storyline. Alongside the tombs that are actually part of the story, optional tombs return. And some of these did give me an actual challenge, and were at the very least more well thought out. Additionally, the optional tombs came alongside some very good rewards, giving the player upgrades that cannot be acquired in any other way. This immediately incentivizes me to continue doing the challenge tombs, and combined with their better design, made them feel like much less of an afterthought. Another new element of exploration is more of an open world approach. The first game was like a roller coaster, moving you from point A to point B without many diversions. There were the occasional collectibles and challenges to go for, but that's about it. Rise of the Tomb Raider, on the other hand, has a bigger map, with more to find and do, including new traditional side missions. While I can see what they were going for with this, these side missions didn't do much to help the experience. They reminded me of the optional tombs from the first game, kinda felt like it was thrown in at the last second. The side missions usually just require you to talk to someone, go do the basic tasks they give you and then come right back. Meanwhile, there was almost never any actual interesting storylines related to them. Nothing about the story was pushed further along by these missions. Another thing that bothered me is that these side missions were often presented as, do this mission to gain their trust, but then nothing would change whether you did it or not. They made it seem as though the game had a camp system where you could build up the different areas, gaining upgrades or new abilities as you improve your standing, but in reality nothing seems to change. Throughout the story, Laura struggles to figure out who she should help, and whether she should just focus on her own goal of getting the artifact. It would have been interesting to see this played out through these side missions, allowing the player to decide for themselves. Maybe this could have affected how the story played out, with certain groups not helping based on those choices. I felt like Rise of the Tomb Raider was trying to emulate the open world formula without actually going all the way, and that's one of my personal pet peeves. Okay, but now here's the good news. That's just about the only complaints I had with the entire game. As for what I loved, it primarily centered around the story. I mentioned how the story of the first game didn't really do it for me. It was too generic and safe. Well, this time around they stepped it up and told a much more intriguing, emotional story. The new characters they introduced, such as Jacob and his army who protect the Divine Source, are far more interesting than Laura's friends from the first game. The main villain, Constantine, is one of those classic action villains who is deeply disturbed and incredibly ruthless. Combine that with his religious beliefs and the deep love for his sister whom he is trying to save, and it all adds up into a very well-rounded character. Meanwhile, I loved Laura's evolution. With this second entry, we see a new side of her. Right away, you can see that she is more confident, more hardened, and more determined. Laura's evolution also takes shape with her having to play hero and help the people of Katesh. In the end, she finds this goal is more important than any discovery she could have made. It's clear the writers want Laura to reach a new status with each entry. If by the end of the first game she's the survivor, then by the end of this game, she's the hero. This concept has me very intrigued to see where they can take it with the third game. The final thing I'll say about the game is that the last hour or two is just utterly fantastic. The story takes a great twist, the action amps up so quickly, and the set pieces are some of the best of the trilogy so far. And more importantly, they are able to stick the landing and deliver a very satisfying ending. Overall, Rise of the Tomb Raider really impressed me. It felt like Crystal Dynamics took everything they had learned from the first game and improved it here. They did a much better job at balancing the new action style with the old school Tomb Raider exploration. And at the end of the day, I would say this entry is everything I could have asked for from a modern Tomb Raider game. In the months following release, Rise of the Tomb Raider made its way off of Xbox consoles. It was released on PC in January 2016, and then it came to PS4 almost exactly 11 months after its initial Xbox exclusive launch. Overall, Rise of the Tomb Raider appeared to be another success for Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix. Initial sales were a little softer than the first game, which was unsurprising considering it was available on less platforms. It also probably didn't help that it came out on the same day as Fallout 4, one of the biggest games of that year. But Rise of the Tomb Raider had good legs, especially once releasing everywhere, selling nearly 12 million units by 2021. With another successful entry down, development began on a third Tomb Raider game shortly after. But the development of this entry would look quite a bit different from what we've seen so far. This brings us to the third and final entry in the Survivor trilogy, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, released in 2018 on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. Now, unlike Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise, I have actually never played this one before. I remember when they were marketing it, something just always looked off to me. I don't even know how to explain it. Something about it just turned me off, so I never ended up playing it. However, I've changed that now, and after completing my playthrough, I have a whole lot to say. Right off the bat, I noticed something pretty important. The lead development team on this game was actually Eidos Montreal, not Crystal Dynamics. Eidos Montreal had supported development of Tomb Raider 2013, so they did have some connection to the trilogy, but I was still shocked to see them take the lead, with Crystal Dynamics being shifted to the support role. As it turns out, Crystal Dynamics had attempted to take on multiple big projects at once, and quickly found it was not going to work out. So they chose to focus on their new upcoming Avengers game instead, and pass Shadow off to Eidos Montreal. Considering my enjoyment of the first two games, it kinda bummed me out to see Crystal Dynamics weren't going to be the ones to finish the job. And while I understand Eidos Montreal had been involved in prior entries, it still feels bizarre to pass off your trilogy finale to a new developer. At the end of the day though, Eidos Montreal is a very good studio. At the time of Shadow's development, they had just released two great modern Deus Ex games, so they were certainly more than capable. We'll see if this development switch affects the game as we embark on Laura's final journey of the Survivor trilogy. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Laura is continuing her fight against Trinity. This time it takes her to Mexico, where she is attempting to find a lost artifact before Trinity can get their hands on it. This artifact ends up being the Dagger of Shakshel, accompanied by scriptures warning of a cleansing. Laura takes the dagger to keep it from Trinity, but in doing so, she unknowingly sets off this cleansing. She is then attacked by Trinity, and the main antagonist of this entry, Pedro Dominguez, reveals to her what she has done. The only way to stop the cleansing is to reunite the dagger with the silver box of Ixchel. Dominguez takes the dagger from Laura, hoping to reunite it with the box, stopping the cleansing, and in turn, allowing him to remake the world. The first sign of the cleansing begins with a tsunami washing through the city. This tsunami sequence was really phenomenal. It's up there with the best in the whole series in my opinion. It has all the intricate action and incredible moving set pieces we expect from the trilogy, but on top of that, it has the added impact of knowing it's all Laura's fault. It's very intense as the scene gets dark quickly with countless bodies being thrown across the screen, all of them due to Laura's decision to take the dagger. This theme of guilt was very intriguing, and I was excited to see where they would take it from here. After surviving the tsunami, Laura and her friend Jonah embark to the Amazon to track down Dominguez, but while in the sky, they are hit by a storm and crash land into the jungle. Here is where we get our first extended gameplay section, and once again, I was really intrigued by what they were building. The jungle is breathtakingly beautiful, and something I noticed right away was that this world felt so much more alive than the prior entries. As you walk through the jungle, you can hear the animals rustling through the leaves, the birds chirping, and the bugs buzzing. Rise of the Tomb Raider had a big focus on animals as well, but it wasn't really like this. Rise had very specific scripted instances where you would fight an animal or certain locations on the map where they would spawn, but Shadow takes it to the next level, building an ecosystem that actually feels lived in. After making our way out of the jungle, we find ourselves in the hidden city known as Paititi, where Laura meets the Queen Unuratu and her son. In this city, Dominguez has cemented himself as a cult leader on his quest to find the box. The rest of the game takes place in this area with this core group of characters, and unfortunately, this is the point in my playthrough where my experience started to take a turn for the worse. I never found myself particularly interested in these new characters from Paititi, and I felt like they were taking away from the things I had been enjoying so far. The natural disaster scenes that had so perfectly captured the heart-pumping action I expected from this reboot trilogy had disappeared. The jungle sequences that had brought out the best atmosphere and exploration of the entire trilogy were gone as well. Instead, I was stuck spending time in this city with characters I didn't really care for. Shadow of the Tomb Raider places a big focus on dialogue, specifically with these Bethesda-esque talking head segments, but unlike Bethesda games, there are no dialogue options, so you're just stuck sitting here watching these animations. I think it would be fair to say dialogue has always been one of the more questionable elements of this trilogy, so placing such a big focus on it in this entry felt bizarre. And as much as I hate to say it, by the time I reached the halfway point of the game, I was pretty bored. It was a lot of walking around, talking to people, and exploring without much action. And I think this is a major point in the game where your experience is going to vary based on what you are looking for. If you are one of the longtime Tomb Raider fans disgusted by the lack of exploration in the 2013 entry, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the game for you. But if you're someone like myself who enjoyed the action and gunplay, it is sorely missed here. I felt Rise of the Tomb Raider found a pretty good balance between the two, and I wish they had kept it that way, instead of leaning so far into exploration in Shadow. With that said though, I think the bigger issue is the combat itself. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I think I could count on both hands the amount of major combat sequences I encountered throughout my 10-hour playthrough, with most of them coming towards the end. Meanwhile, almost all of these smaller combat sequences are very obviously meant to be played stealthily, meaning there are shockingly long stretches of time where you aren't using your weapons at all. You may notice from my gameplay that almost every time I go to pick something up, it's telling me I'm full. And that's simply because I was never using anything. I never had to craft ammo or use any consumables because there were virtually no fights to speak of. For the rare instances that I did get to use my guns, the combat felt worse than the two prior games. To me, this is Shadow's biggest difference and the most obvious sign that this was not made by the same developers. The gunplay in this game feels really strange, and I'm not even sure how to explain why. It's just very mechanical. In the other two games, the way Laura fought felt raw, which made sense for her character. But in this game, the way you shoot and move during combat almost feels robotic. It doesn't feel satisfying or impactful to take people down the way it did in the other games. I suppose the developers knew this, which is why they didn't include as many of these sequences and focus more on stealth and exploration. While I don't mind this focus on exploration, I do take issue with it for one major reason. The exploration feels just about as good as it did in Rise of the Tomb Raider, while the action feels significantly downgraded. If you're gonna place a massive focus on the exploration, I would like to see a big improvement there. I felt it at first in the jungle, but it quickly fell apart as I spent time walking around hub worlds doing boring side quests just like I did in Rise. If you're gonna strip most of the combat, the exploration and story needs to be absolutely top-notch, borderline perfect, and the game just didn't deliver on that whatsoever. I will say, Shadow definitely picked up in the last hour or two. There are some very good action and story sequences towards the end, including what is probably the coolest shot in the entire trilogy. And while I enjoyed these moments, was it worth the other 8 hours I spent bored? The game is just not long enough to justify how slow it is at the beginning. Think about a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. That game notoriously starts super slow, but I'm willing to be more lenient there because once you get past the slow start, there is 50 hours of gameplay waiting for you. But in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, once you get past the slow start, the game ends an hour later, so I can't excuse it in the same way. My last complaint about this game is the fact that it doesn't really feel like a proper conclusion to the trilogy. There are some loose ends that get tied up, such as Jonah and Laura's friendship, and the truth behind the death of Laura's father. But most of the game is not spent on those two things. Most of it is spent on Paititi interacting with characters that had no connection to the prior entries. The Paititi storyline feels completely disconnected from the entire trilogy. It's basically just a backdrop to funnel you to the conclusion of Laura's family, and I think that would help explain why it was hard for me to connect with it. Ultimately, Shadow of the Tomb Raider just ends up feeling like a nice entry within a series of games, but it in no way feels like the climax and resolution of a trilogy, and that was extremely disappointing for me. As for the critical and commercial success of the game, it seemed a bit weaker than prior entries. Among the three games, it has the lowest overall score on aggregate review site Metacritic. Sales also seemed weaker compared to the prior games. By December 2021, the game had sold 8.9 million units, which made it the lowest selling in the trilogy. To be fair though, the other two games had been out much longer at the time of this report, so it's kind of hard to say. But even if that number hasn't improved much over the last few years, remember that Tomb Raider 2013 became the best-selling game in the series when it hit 8.5 million in 2015. So while 8.9 million may not be as much as they were hoping for from Shadow, it still places it among the upper echelon of the Tomb Raider franchise. With the history of all three games laid out and my playthroughs complete, it's time to give my final thoughts on the Survivor trilogy. Overall, I think this reboot is a flawed but incredibly enjoyable experience. If you haven't played them yet, I definitely recommend it. Despite my issues across the various games, there is certainly a lot of fun to be had, and much of it will come down to your personal tastes. Something I may have hated or liked may be the complete opposite for you when it comes to these games. I think the more interesting part of the story here is how these games were perceived at the time of release. As we saw throughout this video, each new installment of the Survivor trilogy came alongside some kind of new controversy or backlash. Whether it was the lack of tombs in 2013, the Xbox exclusivity of Rise, or the developer change with Shadow, there just always seemed to be something with these games. And yet, despite it all, Square Enix, Crystal Dynamics, and Eidos Montreal pulled off a wildly successful reboot trilogy that exceeded all expectations. I think this trilogy is proof that not everything you read about games online always tells the full story. People who engage with gaming discussion online, such as myself and probably you watching this video, are so much more tuned in than most gamers. So while people were debating online about whether Tomb Raider 2013 was a faithful enough adaptation, millions of non-online people were buying the game and thinking, wow, this action is so cool. It's part of what makes a reboot like this so difficult, because it's hard to please everyone. While longtime fans of the franchise were certainly valid in their criticisms, the success of Tomb Raider 2013 shows that Square Enix was right to take the franchise in the direction they did. I also do find it interesting that Shadow of the Tomb Raider gave players that focus on exploration they had asked for, and yet it's the least successful game in the trilogy. Either way, I think it's undeniable that Rise of the Tomb Raider got it right, managing a perfect mix of action and exploration. It's my favorite game in this trilogy by far, and honestly, I love it so much, I think it's worth playing the entire series just for that game alone. Rise of the Tomb Raider is exactly what a modern Tomb Raider should look and play like in my opinion, and I hope they use it as a blueprint going forward. Speaking of, what does the future of Tomb Raider look like following the Survivor trilogy? At the moment, things are uncertain. Unfortunately, the Tomb Raider franchise finds itself in some turmoil once again. In 2022, gaming conglomerate Embracer Group purchased several assets from Square Enix, including the rights to the Tomb Raider franchise and Crystal Dynamics. At the time of this purchase, they announced a new Tomb Raider game was in development, aiming to connect all of the different Tomb Raider timelines. However, we've seen nothing from them since. In the years that have followed Embracer Group's acquisition of Tomb Raider, they have become one of the biggest laughingstocks in the industry. Embracer blatantly overspent, acquiring anything they could get their hands on, all reliant on an expected $2 billion investment that was coming their way. But when that investment fell through, they suddenly had no money to support all of the IPs and studios they had purchased. So in 2024, Embracer Group was forced to sell back most of what they had bought, shut down countless studios, and ultimately split themselves up into 3 entities. Tomb Raider and the developer Crystal Dynamics now fall under the label known as Middle-earth Enterprises. It's hard for me to feel optimistic for this new Tomb Raider game knowing all the mayhem that has gone on behind the scenes, and the radio silence certainly doesn't help those fears either. The last we heard of the game came in June 2024 when the publisher Amazon Games stated that the game was not too far away. Like I said, not feeling too optimistic about this one, but we'll have to wait and see. The good news is they have actually done a pretty good job keeping Tomb Raider relevant throughout these years of restructuring. Laura has been featured in countless crossover events across other games such as her skin in Fortnite and Dead by Daylight. Additionally, there was an animated Netflix series titled Tomb Raider: The Legend of Lara Croft released in 2024. And to top it all off, we received 2 remaster collections bringing the first 6 Tomb Raider games to modern platforms. I gotta give them a lot of credit for keeping the IP alive throughout this long stretch of time without a new game. It should set them up pretty nicely for a big splash, assuming Crystal Dynamics can make it work amidst all of Embracer's chaos. If they can take all of the lessons learned from the Survivor trilogy, we could be in for something truly special, and I hope we'll get to see it very soon. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on the Tomb Raider Reboot trilogy. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. And I would love to know what you think about the Survivor trilogy in the comments below. Thanks for watching.